Hi, welcome to the channel Coders Arc, where we unravel the world of coding and architecture together. And the topic of today's conversation is AWS Lambda layers. Before we look into AWS Lambda layers, let's look at how Lambda functions work without the Lambda layers. As you can see in this diagram, there are two Lambda functions, and both these Lambda functions have their own bundles of dependencies, runtimes, and configurations. Now, if you look closely, there are three bundles between these two Lambda functions that are common. So, what if there was a way to extract these common dependencies and move them into a location where these various Lambda functions could reference them? And that's exactly the principle of Lambda layers. So now let's look at how these Lambda functions will look with the Lambda layers. So in this diagram, you can clearly see that the previous bundles of dependencies, runtimes, and configurations have been moved into their own Lambda layers. And also the Lambda functions have now become quite lightweight since these dependencies reside outside of them. Now there are many other benefits to using Lambda layers like the reduced cold start times. You can also see improvement in performance and runtime efficiencies. And obviously, we've talked about the dependency management aspect of it. The Lambda layers can also be reused across the different accounts. So that's another added benefits of Lambda layers. So now let's look into how these Lambda layers will be implemented using some Python code. First, we will see how Lambda functions work without the Lambda layers, and then we will see how they work with the Lambda layers. So let's dive right into it. Now I'm on the AWS console, and let's navigate to the AWS Lambda service. From here, let's create a new function. Let's give it a name. Let's choose a runtime as Python 3.11. Leave all the other settings as default and click create function. Now you can see that the layers count over here is 0, which means there are no layers applied on this function. Let's add a simple line of code. And let's deploy this function. Now let's test it out. We'll give this a simple payload. Let's test it. So now you can see the import module error. That's because it could not recognize the module named pandas. So we will add pandas using the Lambda layers. Now let's try to create a Lambda layers in the Windows PC. As you know that when the Lambdas run in AWS, they run in the Linux runtime. So what we will try to do is create a Docker image and then create a container out of that Docker image and then deploy that container onto the Lambda layers, and from there we will add the Lambda layers onto the Lambda and see the output. So let's do it step by step. I've already created two files in this folder, Lambda layers demo. So let's look at the contents of these two files. One is a requirements.txt and other is a Docker file. Let's look at requirements.txt. It is nothing but a simple text file that contains the name of the dependency that will go into the Lambda layer, and it's pandas. So let's close it and look at the contents of the Docker file. And the Docker file has the following content. It uses the runtime Python 3.11 runtime. Then it has an install command to install zip so that we can zip the contents for a future use. Then it creates a working directory inside the container, which is the Lambda layers demo. Let's rename it. Then we will take the contents of requirement.txt and put it inside the container's working directory. Then we will install the Python packages, and you can see it's nothing but a simple pip install command using the requirements.txt file. And finally, we will zip the contents. As you can see, we had installed the zip in the previous command. We will run the zip command recursively and extract the contents to be used as a layer. And let's save this Docker file and move on to the Windows PowerShell. Now I'm in the Windows PowerShell, and let's look at the contents of this folder. As you can see, there are only two files, the Docker file and the requirements.txt file. Now let's create an image from this. So I'll use the docker build command and let's execute it. It creates an image. Now let's create a container out of this image. It created the container, and finally let's copy the contents of the layers onto the working directory of the host PC. Okay, now let's look at the contents of this folder again. As you can see, there is a zip file which will serve as the Lambda layers for the Lambda functions. Now let's upload this file into the Lambda layers using AWS console. Now I am back on the AWS console, and let's navigate to layers. Let's click create layers. From here, let's give it a meaningful name. You can upload it from a zip file or upload a file from Amazon S3. Usually AWS recommendation is if the file size is larger than 10 megabytes but less than 50 megabytes, consider uploading using Amazon S3. For file sizes greater than 50 megabytes, there are other options like using the Fargate containers or SageMaker instances, but for now we will not cover those in details. Let's dive right into the runtime. Let's choose Python 3.11 and click create. Now you can see that the Lambda layer is successfully created. So now let's apply it to the function. Go back to Lambda, click on functions, select the function, scroll down and select add a layer. From here, choose custom layers and select your Lambda layer. Choose version 1 and click add. So now you can see that the layers is applied. You can see a count of 1. Now let's test this function out again. And this time you don't see any execution error because the pandas dependencies was successfully imported using the Lambda layers that is applied. So here we are able to see how Lambda layers are applied successfully to Lambda functions. And one other important thing is that there are only 5 layers allowed for a Lambda function at one time. So if you require your code to be pulling in more than 5 layers, then you have to relook at your strategy. Maybe you're choosing Lambdas as the wrong execution component. Maybe you need something bigger like a container that's running in Fargate where there are no size limitations, or running on SageMaker for machine learning models or AI implementations. So through this video, you were able to see how Lambda functions and Lambda layers work together. If you found the value in this video useful, please hit the subscribe and the like button, and please ask me in the comment section what other videos you would like to see. Have a good day. Thank you.